A warm welcome and a very happy new year to everybody. And welcome to our first 75th anniversary Leading Lights session in this new year, 2022. Now, today I'm delighted to welcome as my guest Alice Maynard. She is the Director of Future Inclusion and also an experienced coach and non-executive director at many large public sector organizations, including the FCA and the HMRC, and a member of our 75th anniversary Leading Lights Council. A warm welcome to you, Alice, and Happy New Year.
Thank you very much, and Happy New Year to you and all your guests out there as well.
Thank you. Let's get started. Now, as you know, our 75th Anniversary Council, of which you're a member, is looking at what do we need to do to increase the diversity and inclusion of workplaces that will improve both organizational performance and employee satisfaction, as well as how can we, at this critical juncture, support the UK's recovery from the pandemic and that all-important levelling up agenda. But let me start by asking you some of your own personally held beliefs. Do you think, or I should say, what role do you think that values, ethics, and culture play in today's modern professional management practice, and how should that manifest itself in everyday practice?
So I think this is really fundamental to professional management. I think that the values in an organisation, provided that they are crowdsourced, and by that I mean that the people within the organisation really need to be party to the selection of those values, rather than superimposed and stuck up on the wall and, you know, this is what we believe in, isn't it, chaps? I think that then those values also need to be integral to all decision making. So one of the things that I like to see on a board is that when we make decisions, we at least implicitly refer back to the values. And I think that if something is unethical, it shouldn't be allowed in an organisation anyway. So I think it kind of goes as said. Although what I would argue is that where the organisation has greater powers, then the focus on ethics needs to be stronger. So if you think about the two organisations that I'm on the board of, the FCA and the HMRC, they're both regulators, so they both have enormous powers within society, and therefore the focus on ethics has to be quite strong. And HMRC, for instance, has now got a professional standards committee that looks at ethics. And when it comes to culture, well, there always is one. I mean, it's not that there's a good culture or no culture, it's that there is a culture. So the thing for professional managers is making sure that the culture that they are party to creating in an organisation is a really positive and inclusive one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And how can a manager do that in everyday practice? Give us an example, perhaps from your thinking.
So for me, it's partly about personal behaviour. Mm-hmm. So so the way that people behave and the way that they use what I would call the artifacts around them. So office doors, if there are offices and everybody's not in an open space, coffee machines, who does the washing up or puts things away in the dish, that whole piece. So if a manager is using a shared kitchen, then they should be seen to put their cup in the dishwasher. I know that sounds really silly, but actually that's about, I'm equal to you. I'm not going to leave my cup on the top because you're inferior to me and you're the one that needs to put it in the dishwasher.
I love that example. And as CEO of CMI, I put my cup in the dishwasher, and I kind of do it exactly for that reason, right? Like, why shouldn't I put my cup in the dishwasher too, right? That's a great example. Well, of course, we've all learned from our experiences, and we're always learning. And we all have challenges in our career. And if you think back to when you started your leadership and advisory career and management career, what challenges do you think still exist now that you also faced, and what did you learn that would maybe help others to overcome them?
So I think the ones that I would pick out would be effective performance management. I think it's really difficult to performance manage other people in a good way. And I think we still don't focus enough on that in terms of helping managers and leaders to understand how to do that well, and helping them to recognize that they don't come ready-made. It is a skill that you need to learn. And also the issue of an inclusive culture. We're still not great at inclusive culture. Now, in some ways, that's because our expectations in society, and therefore our expectations as employees in the workplace, have changed over the 40 years. But I still think that we can move with those times, and we need to get up to scratch so that when the expectations change again over the next 20, 30 years, actually we're in a better place to move with them, rather than finding we've been incredibly badly left behind. And I think the things that the other thing actually I was thinking about was good leadership. Because I remember a story that kind of terrified the living daylights out of us when I first joined the IT industry, about one of the big US IT companies that had fired its employees by stopping their passes working. And then I thought about another example from the early days of the pandemic, when someone fired 900 employees on a Zoom meeting. And that showed me that actually, in many ways, things have not changed. So I think the learning that I take from it is it starts with me. I can't expect other people to be marvelous and change and performance manage well and all those things if I don't do that. It takes courage, because actually it's not easy to do some of this stuff. And it's not easy to find out the things you need to find out in order to be able to do things well. It doesn't actually, I'm sorry everybody, but it doesn't get any easier. The older you get, it doesn't necessarily get any easier. It still takes the same amount of courage. But I think the biggest thing I would say is watch your expectations. From the "it starts with me" perspective, what you expect of others is generally what they will be able to deliver. And there are those experiments that they did with school children and also salespeople, where they divided them up and told the leader of in each context that the group was going to be marvelous or it was going to be rubbish. And lo and behold, the marvelous group was marvelous and the rubbish group was rubbish. So watch your own expectations, because you can make a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, very good point. And how you communicate and how you make others feel as a manager and leader has great impact. If you go back to the guy, for example, that fired the people over Zoom, right? Now, maybe what's a little different is that got called out globally, right? And lots of people, including me at CMI, were asked to comment on it. And he faced so much backlash that he had to apologize, right? Now, he didn't lose his job, but at least he had to say, I got that wrong. So let's hope that he's recognized the impact of his actions and he learns, as you said, to performance manage better, because right, he did not do a good job of that at all, did he? Okay, well, obviously expectations are changing, institutions are changing. You know, we're never going to change as slow in the future as we did today. So that pace of change is accelerating. How do institutions in all of this find the right balance between continuity and change?
So for me, there's something about respecting organisational knowledge. And that's organisational knowledge from, depends which way up you have your organisation chart, but from the bottom to the top or the top to the bottom, depending on how you like to do these sorts of things. Because everybody has an element of organisational knowledge. I remember when I was in the rail industry, and there was a big shift, and they were revamping the culture, and it was all going to be completely different, and we were going to get rid of all the old dead wood. And some of that dead wood, in inverted commas, had huge repositories of organisational knowledge. You could go up to them and go, which of these stations has freight going through it? And they could reel them off. And you lost that. And that was actually quite a negative thing for the organisation. So respect organisational knowledge, support people who find it difficult to change. And one of the ways in which to do that is to be prepared to change yourself. Mm-hmm. So that is not just, for me, that's not just about bringing the change in. It's about changing the way you bring the change in, potentially, based on the feedback that you're getting from the organisation and the feedback that you're getting from the people who are there already, who are finding it difficult. Because actually, the way that you're doing things may need to change because of that.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you're saying there is that so much of managing change is about communicating with people.
Absolutely. But communication being a two-way thing, it's more than that. I mean, it's a multi-way, fluid movement between people.
You're absolutely right. And obviously, people hear different things versus what was said. Well, one of the things, huge theme for us at CMI and for the 75th anniversary council is looking at various forms of discrimination. Now, despite all the focus, for example, on gender equality, we know that if anything in the pandemic, it's gone backwards, and we're still decades away from achieving that. What are your key tips for how leaders at every level can make sure that as many women as men are achieving their ambitions? And what can you share with us from your own experience about making sure we have equal talent pipelines?
So I find this really interesting because I find it very difficult to divide people into their individual bits of social identity. And so as soon as we start talking about women progressing, I kind of start thinking about, well, there are some women who are single, there are some women who are in partnerships. Those partnerships might be same-sex partnerships, they might be opposite-sex partnerships. There are women who have transgendered, there are women who have children and women who don't have children, and all those experiences need different approaches potentially. And so my thing is about, we're back to this business about leaders understanding themselves and their approaches to people, and understanding that people are different, and that they likewise are different. The leader themselves has a number of identities, and I know that there are programs that are helpful. I actually went on a program when I was in my 20s, late 20s, I think, called Strategies for the Successful Woman. It was run by PwC, and or whatever it was at the time. I think might have just been Price Waterhouse, but anyway, I went on that program. I remember not benefiting from it as much as my colleagues on the program, my co-learners, and actually not. I mean, I loved bits of it, but I remember not feeling very comfortable in it. And I wouldn't have known why at the time, because I was a disabled person in denial. So I can look back and go, okay, that's because it wasn't really talking to me. It was talking to women, but not me as a woman. And I think there are many of the programs are tailored in a way that doesn't entirely help all the different women out there. So I mean, I think what I would say is that monitoring, I mean, data is important, because actually if your data tells you that women are not progressing, or women are not at the right levels in the organisation, or men are not progressing, which actually some of our data tells us these days. So if it's telling you that kind of thing, you need to address it, and you need to work out what you need to do, and have an action plan to do it. And that might include specific programs for women, for instance, but it's much more for me about being inclusive and engaging an inclusive culture. And there's a concept in the disability world around making reasonable adjustments. I don't think that reasonable adjustments are just for disability. I think they're for everybody. And actually, if we talk about workplace adjustments and we make sure that they are available to everyone, then actually they will help women to progress as much as any programs, monitoring, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. And could you give us an example that you've seen of a reasonable adjustment that you think would work well for women?
Well, so I think bringing us kind of up to date, I think one of the things that is really going to help women now is the focus on menopause, and enabling people who are going through very difficult stages of menopause to take a bit of time out, a bit like pregnancy leave or whatever, maternity leave. So I think that for me is an example of a workplace adjustment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent example. Something that actually all women eventually experience, right? So, well, when it comes, I guess, as you've hinted at some of your thoughts on the answer to the next question, but when we're looking to address the different forms of discrimination, which include disability, ethnicity, sexuality, both in terms of, gender, born sex, but also how we identify and choice of sexual partners, they include all of those things, age as well. Do you think it's best when it comes to the remedies that were reasonable adjustments that we put in place, as well as when it comes to the data, because you've touched on both, to treat these individually, or should we seek to somehow combine them? So on the one hand, the data gathering, and on the other hand, the reasonable adjustments. What is your view as to how we make progress as a whole on building this greater inclusivity?
So it's a kind of interesting question, that, and it's one that I can't give you a straight answer to, because it's one that if I told you I believed one thing today, I'd tell you I believed a different thing tomorrow. I haven't really made my mind up about this. I get cross sometimes with the splitting up of identity. and I get concerned about the bits that we're leaving out. So, you know, we're not just women of a certain age, of a certain sex, of a certain sexual preference, of etc., etc. We are all sorts of bits and pieces, and we leave those bits out. Actually, are those the bits that will really matter for an inclusive culture? Who knows? And so sometimes, some days I think, oh, no, we really need to think about inclusion. And some days I think, well, maybe actually collecting the data on individual bits and pieces will help us edge towards, if we address them, the data, obviously, if we just don't collect it, but we actually do something useful with it, that will help us to edge towards a greater inclusion, which will then help us to spot the bits that we're missing, because those will start to emerge. As people get more comfortable bringing their whole selves to work, the bits of themselves that are not being dealt with by particular action plans, programs, data collecting, etc., etc., will begin to emerge and percolate to the surface. If I'm allowed to be a disabled woman, Christian, older, etc., then once I've done that, maybe something else that I've been suppressing and has been missing will percolate up to the surface. And then we can think about dealing with that. And that's, I think, partly what I was talking about when I was talking about the change or lack of it over 40 years and the potential change or in societal expectation over the next 20, for instance, because things will be very different in 20 years.
And do you think that that data, because this is another hot topic of debate, should be that government should mandate that data to be collected, or that it should be disclosed willingly by individuals in the workplace? Because obviously we can't necessarily see somebody's sexuality or even disability. You know, how do we deal with that conundrum in your view?
I think there's a big issue here around trust, because you have to be able, if you're going to disclose some of your data, the bits that aren't glaringly obvious, for instance, then you need to trust the agency to which you are disclosing. And it strikes me always, and I've got some evidence of this from the consulting days, that I was a consultant for a long time. There's some evidence that actually building trust initially in the plans of the organisation, in what the organisation is going to do with the data, etc., do raise the level of disclosure. And so where I see very, very low levels of disclosure, I think the culture's not yet there. It's not yet at a point. Now, if the government mandates data disclosure, then it's going to get very difficult for some people in their organisations, because even if the organisation is technically trustworthy and is going to do the right thing, actually, if you don't trust them to, then your behaviour will change. And it could be quite tricky, let's say. So I'm not sure I'm with data disclosure. I'm with encouragement, and I'm with a government doing a lot more around explaining why it's a good thing, and why organisations should respond well to people disclosing their data. But I think we've got a lot more education to come.
Absolutely, and CMI's research backs you up on that. When employees, for example, understand why organizations want the data and they see their organizations doing something. So, for example, if an organization has closed its gender pay gap and then asks employees to report on ethnicity, they're much more likely to give their ethnicity because they think, oh, well, okay, because the leadership has said we're asking for this data because we want to do something with it. We want to help close these gaps. By the way, we are taking questions at the end of the broadcast, so if you have them, and I see we're getting many great ones already, please do put them in the chat, because you'll have the opportunity to ask Alice lots of questions later on. But meanwhile, I want to talk a little bit about technology. We've seen huge advances in, for example, this kind of conversation during the pandemic, but advances in technology overall. Do you think that technology will be able to help? I mean, some people say video technology will help women with caring and men with caring responsibilities, and indeed people with disabilities, because it will enable them to work better remotely, for example. Do you think that there are ways in which technology will help us to accelerate progress on inclusivity, and if so, how?
So I think technology and inclusion is really interesting, because in some ways it drives inclusion, and in some ways it actually drives exclusion. So it partly depends on how the technology is managed and used. And there are all sorts of different approaches to this, and I think we are learning a lot through the pandemic, because there's a lot of kind of stuff out there. You can read loads of stuff about whether you should have your camera on, you shouldn't have your camera on, whether you know what you should do, etc. But and in some respects, it makes it easier for, say, for people with some impairments to engage, but it makes it harder for others. So if you've got multiple people on Zoom calls and maybe they don't have their cameras on, then if you're a lip reader, you're going to be pretty stuffed. But actually, you can have a signer. So my local church has someone who signs, who's a member of it. So every Sunday, the service can be signed, because it's on Zoom and you can pin the signer if you're one of the deaf attendees. So there are, and the things about, some of the things about managers engaging with their staff during the course of the pandemic and understanding how to do that, or how to run a meeting well. You know, you can't just take the real world and stick it on into the virtual world and expect it to run in the same way. And I think so there are some things around discrimination that might actually improve, because you might find that the atmosphere for you is less bullying and harassing. But actually, you could find that the bullying and harassment turns into a kind of deliberate exclusion. So I'm not sure that it's as straightforward as it makes it better or it makes it worse.
It goes back, doesn't it, to that, how it's applied to the culture of the organization, doesn't it? So you made that point in this answer. It's how the technology is used, and how you train people and managers to use that technology. We know that 2/3 of managers have not been trained to manage hybrid workers, for example. And yet it isn't just a case of transplanting the real world meeting into a virtual setting. You may have some people in the room, some people not. And how you manage that is incredibly important. So there's a lot to learn, as you rightly say. Some of it good, some of it not good, but we can learn from both things. Okay, well, you know, we've talked a little bit about the pandemic. Now you, as you've referenced and we've discussed, are non-executive on a couple of big public sector regulatory boards. What do you think boards have learned, and what have you learned about the role of both the board and the non-executive in the pandemic?
So I've learned the importance of social capital, and how actually we need a good, effective board does need some face-to-face time. You can do a good job, but it becomes quite transactional over over a technological solution, and that's not always the best way to build a board, an effective board, develop a board. So, and as I said, you can't just pick up real life and stick it on the screen. It doesn't quite work that way. I've learned that I like meeting people. Now, I'm an introvert, so that came as quite a surprise. So I do like meeting real people in real life, and I don't like all-day screens. I've certainly learned that. Public sector organisations, I don't think this is just public sector organisations actually, but I think we've learned to be more flexible. I know that before the pandemic, HMRC would have said, their customer service director would have said, can't do our jobs from home. It's not possible. Now, it is possible, provided that the circumstances in the home environment are suitable and secure enough, because obviously a lot of the discussions, you don't want your discussion about tax to be heard by everybody else in the house. But so that concept of actually the things that we thought were set in stone are no longer set in stone. That's been quite a jolt for many organisations. So I think they've learned to become more flexible, and particularly, as we talked about earlier, to listen to staff. So listen to that feedback, because it's become more important, because you can't see what's going on. So you don't assume you know what's going on. And I think that's been a really important change. And that there are still inclusion issues, but they're different. So you need to be flexible around that as well, and say, what's different now about driving an inclusive culture?
Yes, and I think, for example, the whole homeschooling dilemma, right, where suddenly many people, again, mostly women, had to not only be available for screen calls, but be available for homeschooling. They faced a double challenge, and how organizations adjust for that, how they respond, can either increase inclusion or decrease it.
Yeah,
and we did see that. And you know, do you think our political leaders, what do you think they've learned about from COVID-19 and perhaps the importance of management?
Oh, that's a difficult question.
If you want to say no comment, it's okay.
I might want to say no comment, or I might even go as far as to say, I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of talk about understanding the data and using the data to make decisions. Because we hear that said, but we don't see how, that if that's point A, we then see point Z where the decision has been made, but we can't understand how we get from A to Z because we don't see that process. It feels as if that is not actually real, as it were, that we're going to rely on the data, although it may be. And I think maybe our political leaders are learning that data is important in ways that perhaps they didn't recognize before, but that will also bring with it an understanding of the subtleties of the data. So actually you can look at one piece of data and another piece of data, and the interpretation might be completely different, for instance. So hopefully that will help in other contexts going forward.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, the following the science catchphrase. But you're right, equally, it's about having trust on and some transparency of how that data is being used to make the decision. So how did you go from A to Z, exactly as you said? And a lot of people have challenged that because they've wanted to see more about how that's being used. But it's a good point about respect for the data. So switching tack, we were talking earlier in our 75th Council about the importance of seeing people like me in leadership roles. So that brings us to the importance of, yes, successful mentoring, but also actually perhaps even greater successful sponsorship. People in senior positions actively sponsoring those below them who may not look like them, but who may, help to understand them. Have you been sponsored in your career? And if so, what impact did this have?
No, I think would be the answer to that. Not in the normal understanding of sponsorship. What I have had is a lot of encouraging people around me at various points, and I still do.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember once while I was in the rail industry, I went and asked somebody once to become my mentor, and they were a bit puzzled by that request, but said yes, and then did absolutely nothing. And I took a huge amount of courage on my part to go and see them because they were very senior. And I didn't dare go back and say, excuse me, but, could you do something? It involves doing something. And no, I can't tell you what, because that's the whole point.
But how did that make you feel?
It added to the issues I was having at the time, let's say, which is partly why I wanted to sponsor in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a brave thing to do, to ask, and it must have been very dispiriting to not to see the action back the words. But on so many issues of inclusion, the action doesn't back the words, right? We have lots of words.
Yeah.
We need more actions. Okay, and who inspires you as a leader? Any leading lights for you?
I have lots and lots of leading lights. They are all people I know.
Mm-hmm.
I know lots of amazing women and amazing men, and I learn from them all. I like to think I have a little collection of amazing men and women who, many of whom are not publicly known figures or might be within a small circle, but they're just people who are supportive, who are encouraging, who are in many instances quite driven in their own careers.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure I could look at anybody and say, I've modelled myself on them. Sometimes I joke and I say that when I was a young woman, Michael Flanders was my role model because he was the only wheelchair user I knew anywhere in any position of public whatever. So I didn't know any. I mean, there were no role models for me. I was forging something.
Right. Well, that's telling in its own right, isn't it? And but so you amassed Alice's collection of leading lights. Which is great. That's what a lot of us do, I think. So, what does a better, fairer society, more inclusive society look like to you?
It looks like one where we're all proud of being different.
Mm-hmm.
And where there is no barrier to us achieving our potential, whatever that is, and whatever we want to do. We don't all want to become chief exec of Unilever or whatever, but whatever we want to do, there are the barriers to achieving that don't exist. That everyone can live what I call the good life. Oh, well, actually, I didn't call it the good life. There's a guy called William Torbert who wrote a paper called The Good Life, What's the Good Life? And he talked about 4 things. He talked about having good work, good money, good friends, and good questions. And I think my vision is of a future where everyone can do that. Whatever they define as good money, or good, which might be not a lot of it, but it'll come from the right places, and good work, and particularly the good friends who ask the good questions and who prompt you to change, to move, to become more inclusive yourself, because we're all exclusive in some ways. And I think that's my vision of the future.
That's a great vision and a very encouraging one. And so what would be your message to managers as to how they can help, in their everyday behaviors, advance those four things, and maybe in particular, the good work?
So I think managers who expect the best get it. So we're back to expectation. Managers, there's an enormous responsibility on managers to look honestly at their people and stop going, oh, she'll never be able to do that, or he always does this, or don't look at people that way. Expect the best from them. That would be my message to managers.
That's great. And then support and encourage them to achieve it. Well, Alice, thank you so much. Some really insightful and powerful words there. We have a lot of questions. I want to give people time to ask them. The first is from Colin, and he says, how often should you refresh values to create crowdsourced involvement, as there will always be recruits who don't have involvement in their creation?
That's absolutely right. And actually really crowdsourcing values can take an awful lot of time and effort. So it isn't something you want to do every day, as it were. And anyway, the values in an organisation really needs to be embedded. Even though they might be crowdsourced, they still need to be embedded. So I would say, I'm just kind of making this up as I go along, frankly,
That's
Colin.
all right.
Why not? I would say maybe every 5 to 10 years. One of the things that I think is important is if you use your values in your recruitment process, you will attract the people for whom those values are meaningful. So if those are genuinely the values you want your organisation to have, then to some extent you want your recruits to come going, I believe in those things.
Yeah, very important. And use them as a guide in the decision making, as you said at the outset. Okay, question from Sally. Great session, says Sally. I'm dealing with an increase in menopause related claims. What do you think about something I'm advocating, which, like mental health first aiders, but for menopause, to help managers and workplaces manage menopause? So menopause first aiders or menopause champions or mentors or whatever.
I think it's a good idea. I think that actually one of the most important things that we can do for people is enable peer support. And that's kind of what mental health first aiders does. And so to put this in place for other such issues, I think is really important. And it's one of the things that I'm not advocating a menopause network, but it's one of the things that employee networks do. They enable that level of peer support in your workforce. Because I think as leaders and managers, we need to recognise that we don't have all the answers, and we don't have all the skills and capabilities that are needed to support people. So that peer support issue is quite important, I think. So yes, definitely that.
Great. So go for it, Sally. You've got the thumbs up from Alice. And I agree with you. Question from Vicky. Do you think emotional intelligence needs to be a taught skill as a fundamental component of leadership training, just as ethics needs to be, both as fundamental elements in basic leadership training, leading to respect of each other?
So that's an interesting question, because I would I probably want to do some more kind of thinking or reading around this. In as much as, can you teach emotional intelligence? I'm not sure whether you. I think what you can do is you can enable individuals to build their emotional intelligence, stretch their emotional intelligence muscles, if you like. And certainly in a leadership training program, it would be a good idea to give people the opportunity to do those exercises. And I think for me, coaching is one of the ways in which you can do that, because that helps people to reflect on their own emotional intelligence, how they're using it, where they're maybe not exercising it in the way that they could do, and therefore, letting that muscle atrophy, if you like.
Yeah, it's a really important point. We like to say at CMI that actually emotional intelligence, to a large degree, is understanding the impact of your behavior on others. So it's being self-aware, actually, right? And especially when you're managing a group of people. And of course, you're also impacted by the behavior of your boss. And so it is about being aware of how your behavior impacts others, how other people's behavior impacts you, and how you channel that in a way that is constructive. So it is, we would argue at CMI, you can learn it, as you say, you can exercise that muscle. And I think you said it should be a part of leadership training, and we would agree with you. But the next question here is now from Andy. Disabled people have been more affected by job losses due to the pandemic, and there needs to be positive change within business to embrace diversity if these people are not to be left behind. Any thoughts?
Absolutely. I'm not sure how optimistic I am about this, because partly because I still see a real focus on women and race. This is where my bit, I said I was sitting on the fence about whether or not I preferred inclusion, or I thought it was a good idea to look at individual diversity strands. Well, this is one of the areas where I see, and I often see lists of characteristics, identities that do not include disability. So they include age, religion, gender, race, ethnicity, and so on and so on. But they don't include disability. And it makes me go, well, what are they saying then? Are they actually saying that disabled people are not welcome? And some of the phraseology around it is quite interesting as well. So I think we really, as organisations, we definitely need to change. I think disability is a Cinderella identity within the various social identities, but I still think that as long as we keep in mind that progress on one identity can be used to springboard progress on another identity, and we actually see those crossovers between the various different action plans or whatever that we have, I think that that we still need to make sure that we take an inclusion approach rather than an individual identity approach. So I'm not sure that's going to help Andy very much, but
well, I think it goes back to what you said. You wished for a more inclusive society, is where our differences are celebrated, and so rather than ignore them, we celebrate them. And I suppose that's what you're saying should apply to disabled people, and as much as it does to older people, and indeed older disabled people who are female and whatever else. So it's because I think what you're saying is we all have multiple identities, but it often gets left out, is what you're saying. And I think that there's a message there that we need to listen to and take forward as managers and leaders to make sure that it doesn't. So here we have a question from Graham. How important do you think it is to have a blended approach to agile working, mixing home and office working? There are good arguments for both. This is the so-called hybrid working model.
So again, I think this is one that needs to be managed quite carefully, because there are some jobs, and this is another thing the public sector has learned from the pandemic, there are some jobs that really can't be done at home, and there are some jobs, I mean, you can't collect the bins at home, and you can't put a needle in somebody's arm at home either, for that matter. I'm really fortunate, I think, because I can work from home, but as I've mentioned, I think we need to build that social capital. So I'm interested to see over the longer term the outcome of some of the experiments that some organisations are putting in place, where they have abandoned their offices completely. Because I don't know how that will work, and I think we need to see how that works, and whether or not there are enough examples going forward is another question. So I think one of the things that we might need to watch really carefully is whether or not the fact that some jobs can be hybrid and some jobs can't be hybrid, they have to be place-based, if you like, whether that drives another sort of exclusion, and whether we will be looking in 10 years' time at how we manage that bit of the inclusion question. So yes, there are good arguments for both. There are also arguments against both, and I think it's too early, given how we were catapulted into this to a large extent. I think it's too early to make judgments as to the best way. And I think what has to happen at the moment is that leaders and managers need to be open and aware to the impact that their choices of either are having on their people, and listen and communicate and adjust accordingly. I think that's the only way we can get through this bit until we have more evidence of one or the other.
Yeah, and indeed, enlightened organizations, Alice, are doing exactly that. In our experience, they are experimenting, many with hybrid formulas, and they're learning and listening and adjusting, just as you say. And I think that's probably the best approach, rather than going all one way, i.e., everybody remote, or all one way, i.e., everybody present all the time. So watch this space, as you say. It's still relatively early days. Now, our last question, and thank you all for some brilliant questions. And by the way, if you want to get involved in CMI's 75th anniversary debates, please click the link below. We really welcome your input. But our last question comes from Kelly, and she asks, how important is employee engagement in building culture?
It's critical. Employees form the culture. And I say that advisedly, because actually the leaders and managers are employees too. So everybody within the organization forms the culture. It's reflected in, the culture is reflected in the artifacts. So in some organizations, you'll find no personal stuff anywhere. And in some organizations, you'll find the heaving with personal stuff. And actually that can apply to teams as well. Teams within organisations, departments, divisions, whatever you call them, can have different cultures as well. But actually, if you have a particular culture in your organisation, or there are aspects of your culture that you think need to change to become more inclusive, then because the employees form the culture, actually engaging the employees in changing it is absolutely critical. And it may well be that the employees are, the people are going along with the culture and conforming themselves to the culture and actually would really like to change it.
Yeah, you're right. It goes back to what your first point was, that culture, every organization has a culture. It's just whether it's good or bad, and employees have to be part of shaping that culture because their behaviors do. So again, we want to try and create the best cultures we can. Well, Alice, thank you so much for your time today. You've been incredibly insightful and articulate, and I'm sure that I and everybody has really loved hearing your views. We'll be using much of this again in our 75th anniversary content and in the outputs of the council that Alice is a member of. Thank you all for joining us today on this Leading Lights discussion. Thank you. Huge thank you to Alice. And if you've enjoyed today's session and you're not yet engaged as a friend or member of CMI, please join us, and you can find out how to do so in the chat. Thanks very much, and Happy New Year again, and thank you, Alice.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for listening.
Pleasure.